Okay, hello everyone. Hello, Stephen. Thank you all for joining us today on our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman, an amazing scientist, artist from the States, and very glad to see you all. And first of all, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty for organizing this event, and also American Space Almaty for having you all here. And the first big thanks go to Mr. Stephen Friedman. Thank you very much for having these talks, and I wish you all good luck. And also, please feel free to ask our questions, give our comments. We will be definitely answering them. And stay in touch. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah. And thank everybody for joining us tonight. Well, I'm in Los Angeles, so it's my evening, your morning. I want to thank, as I always like to do, the consulate, the American consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Tracy, Aaliyah, and Consul General Eric Meyer for the opportunity to discuss philosophy, discuss philosophical approaches to a whole range of issues that we hear discussed, commented upon from lots of perspectives, scientific perspectives, sociological perspectives, literary perspectives, but not so much, not commonly philosophical perspectives. And this series is an opportunity to address issues from that particular direction, which is a unique direction, right? One that, as I've been stressing, is characterized by operating within incontestability, certainty. Whatever is not incontestable, rigorous to the point of not being able to be doubted, whatever is not that, it's not philosophy. Okay? And that's the core of this. We approach things also with reference to art. I'm also an artist. Science, we've seen science play an important role in these talks. But what's especially important about the philosophical perspective is that it's operating from the highest level of generality and the highest level of rigor. So it's as if it's looking down at the world from the highest possible platform to achieve the broadest perspective. And its results not only are general in that they apply to everything. So philosophy investigates the nature of being, what it is to exist at all. But it also operates at the extreme of specificity. So unlike the sciences that model systems that will abstract from details of complex systems, like complex weather systems, to provide methods of prediction, philosophy does not model. Philosophy does not theorize. Philosophy leaves nothing out. And it turns out that that extreme aspect of the philosophical endeavor, the philosophical enterprise, to be the most general, the most rigorous, and yet the most comprehensive, the most specific in terms of all the details it attends to, makes the philosophical orientation and perspective unique and uniquely powerful. The most powerful of all perspectives, powerful enough to have created the sciences, powerful enough to advance mathematics, to criticize mathematics from a higher level of rigor, and everything else, and clarify our understanding of all these different human activities. Now, the format for tonight, the general topic is happiness. After an hour, give or take, I will stop. We will address questions. We have 4 questions left over from the last week and one previous week. I'm not going to go into them now, but just the questions deal with issues of Plato, altruism, love, and some considerations about past and future. So that I will address at the end of this investigation, this philosophical exploration of happiness. Now, this particular topic has a genealogy. It has a point of origin. Before these talks, I have a sort of a protocol I go through. I will walk, in the afternoon, because I walk, considerably, 12, 13 kilometers a day. And I walk to think, partly. So that's kind of a productive time for me. Then I'll have dinner, take a little nap, then I'll take a shower. And then I'll get dressed and I'll get ready. Well, all during these preparatory phases, I will be running through my talk. But as I've mentioned in the past, nothing is scripted. So I'll make notes. In fact, I'll show you. And you can't read this, but here's like a page of notes that I'll make for what I'm likely to talk about. But every time I go through the talk, it's different. And it's important that philosophy, I feel, be communicated that way because it gives it a vitality. It's responsive to the moment and the particular sort of mood and thoughts that might be otherwise sort of running through my mind. And they will always be different than the thoughts that I had at any previous sort of run through, of the set of sort of issues I wanted to address. Well, sometimes dramatically different. Well, last week I was talking about philosophical empowerment. But when I went into the shower and I was sort of running through just thinking about the talk, what I kept going to was something that did not enter the talk specifically, but it was the opening of André Malraux. I've mentioned André Malraux a lot, the 20th century French intellectual, writer, art historian, French minister of culture, only person from Picasso ever stopped painting when Malraux would visit the studio, considered one of the great conversationalists of the 20th century. Well, this work of his that I've also mentioned repeatedly, Anti-Memoirs, which was a great inspiration for my philosophical work, not in terms of answers it would provide, but questions it would raise. As Malraux wrote at the beginning of the work, and as I've mentioned a few weeks ago, the questions that death raises about the meaning of the world, those kinds of questions. Well, turns out Anti-Memoirs begins with an anecdote that Malraux tells. It happened during World War II when he's visiting with a chaplain of a small French village, Glières. And he asked the chaplain what confession taught him about human life. He was a Roman Catholic priest, so he dealt with confession. That's one of the sacred rites, of the Roman Catholic tradition. Well, the chaplain responded immediately, oh, well, confession, it's sacred, it's a rite. It doesn't really sort of communicate in a normal way. It's not that kind of relationship. But he said, but actually, when it comes down to it, first, people are much more unhappy than anyone thinks. And secondly, he said, there's no such thing as a grown-up person. But the most important thing of that conversation that kept running through my mind last week before I gave that talk on philosophical empowerment was that comment, people are much more unhappy than anyone thinks. And we kind of have to take that sort of comment seriously in the sense that people are not very honest with others, about their distress. We in public, in society, we tend to, put on a smiling aspect, right? If the convention is if you ask somebody, how are you? The response is something perfunctory, something based on social conventions. I'm fine. How are you? We don't take it as an invitation typically to go into a litany of complaints, ailments, concerns, frustrations, right? Even more than that, there's a documentary that just premiered in the United States, maybe internationally, called Fake Famous. I think that's the title. It deals with the phenomenon of internet fame, of people that are internet influencers. I mean, certainly internet, social media is a central part, of world culture and has been for a decade or more at this point. Well, this was an investigation into a lot of the background stories behind a lot of these influencers, people that have large numbers of followers, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers. It turns out there's an extraordinary number. There are many, many millions of people online that have more than 100,000 followers. And it turns out that a lot of it is contrived, even on the part of celebrities. It turns out that, for example, in Los Angeles, there's the interior of a private plane, okay, that is rented out a little bit for filming, but it's mostly booked for short periods of time by people who are taking selfies and trying to represent themselves as flying on a private plane around the world, okay? And it turns out that set, really, that interior of this plane is booked 24 hours a day, every day, okay? Turns out you can, when somebody has 100,000 followers, that may not mean 100,000 unique individuals. It turns out you can buy for relatively small amounts of money thousands and tens of thousands of followers. So, and the world of the internet represents a very rosy picture, of many people's lives, but it's not quite true. Okay, and again, the testimony of that chaplain, right, is of the pervasiveness of happiness, of unhappiness, the pervasiveness of unhappiness in the human condition. There are lots of testimonials to that effect. There's a California philosopher, a West Coast philosopher from the 1960s that I mentioned before, Eric Hoffer, who wrote a book at the end of his life called Before the Sabbath. And in that book, he comments that if you study the lives of outstanding individuals, the majority of them do not experience more than 24, a day's worth of happy moments in their lifetime. Okay? He made the point that for most outstanding individuals, the number of the total amount of happiness that they experience in the course of their life doesn't add up to more than one 24-hour day. He also made the point that his reconciliation to life as it is stems in no small measure from the fact that in his lifetime, people far more deserving and gifted than himself died like rats in trenches, in German concentration camps, in Soviet labor camps. And that comparison of not his life to that of an internet influencer that's maybe contriving or manufacturing images and experiences, but to the worst that humanity has suffered, was able to keep him in a state of emotional equilibrium. It's actually something that I was doing when I was before I read Eric Hoffer, when I was in college and studying Andre Malraux, but also beginning, to develop philosophical ideas. I always had the concentration camps in mind, that was something that people had lived through. And their having lived through that meant that anything that I'm likely to experience is endurable, okay, and not to be complained about. So that can help one in one's orientation, right, to experience. There's a couple of others. Yeah, there's another comment that I wanted to mention. Actually, two more, just to set the stage here. It's been said that if you aim high enough, most of your life will be a failure. Churchill spent most of his years out of power. And while you're sort of contemplating the failures, as you strive for extraordinary heights, typically there's dissatisfaction, unhappiness. Okay, again, something that's common to the human condition. And one little anecdote that also stands out on this issue: Tolstoy, towards the end of his life, on his estate, I forget it, Yasna Polyana, something to that effect, was one day out on the grounds and sees a frog who is croaking, right? Happily, as Tolstoy intuited it. And he commented to himself, "It's warm. The sun is shining. You're happy. I'm not." Now, Tolstoy was a religious spirit, and that issue of the unavailability, of happiness was a fundamental issue, for him, as for religious spirits generally. I'm going to go into that. Okay, so last week, I was making the point in relation to that famous statement, "The truth shall set you free," that the strongest of all truths is philosophic truth, because it's the limit of rigor. And by definition, there's nothing stronger, okay? So we were talking about how philosophy operating at that limit has the power to free one from a whole list of human concerns: pain, suffering, fear, indignity, the past, expectation, judgment, right? A whole list of issues that we saw that if we apply like the rigor of philosophic thinking, it undercuts the assumptions and presumptions and claims that those kinds of issues are grounded in, okay? Well, in a similar way, the philosophical power to set us free from that list of issues is also power to promote human happiness in the individual case. Certainly, part of the impediment to happiness would be any of those items on that list, right? Fear or judgment or comparing ourselves to others, right? We've seen that rigorously, we can't make comparisons. We don't know exactly how someone's experiencing whatever their life is. We don't know how our experience of the color blue compares to that of any other individual. And aside from whatever blue might present itself, we don't know the nature or the intensity of that experience. Someone's experience of the color blue could be greater than someone else's sort of sense of fulfillment from having achieved an extraordinary measure of fame, right? We have examples of that in the literature, especially like the religious and philosophical literature of the world, of people who are focused upon a blue circle, until many years of contemplation later, they see that circle as Vishnu or Krishna or Brahma or the supreme deity of some form or other. So again, whatever distinguishes us from anyone else, namely we exist, they exist, we exist in different places, means that we can't fully intuit, can't rigorously compare. Even when it comes to issues of happiness, especially when it comes to issues of what someone else's experience of happiness might be. Now, part of what the rigor of philosophy implies is that one can't give like detailed prescriptions for what others should do to achieve happiness. One can share one's own experience. One can share one's analyses, and I'm going to do that. But the concept of a guru, a teacher, a spiritual sort of healer that can intuit, your circumstances and give you incontrovertible advice it's anathema to philosophy. Philosophy rejects that, rejects the presumption of that, and in a sense, the indignity of that. No one has that type of access to your unique experience. Okay. When we are talking about the issue of happiness in a philosophical context, it's interesting. There's one main philosopher who comes to mind, and it's useful in this type of discussion because it's one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, and that's Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book on ethics. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics, but a book on ethics in which happiness and the investigation and analysis of happiness plays a central role. In fact, Aristotle defines happiness as the ultimate human good, what people ultimately are striving for. Now, one of the things interesting about that is, like, I have not, in talking about the philosophical sort of perspective or solutions, that we've been, exploring, used the term happiness very much, right? I've been using more extreme terms, more religious terms. Not that philosophy is religion, it's not, but that some of these religious terms capture the power of what philosophy is capable of. Namely, terms like salvation, Buddhist enlightenment, or nirvana, or mystical union with God, right? Aristotle is not using those terms for the ultimate end of human life for a number of reasons. Partly, Aristotle is not fundamentally what we would call a religious spirit. Aristotle was very much, at least in his philosophical work, a man of the world. He was as much scientist, biologist, observer, naturalist, as he was abstract thinker, philosopher. He was married. He was married twice. It's an interesting aspect of the history of philosophy that, at least in the West, most first-order philosophers never married. Socrates did. Aristotle did, not Plato, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Locke, Hume, Kant, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, not. There is kind of an otherworldliness to what philosophers are doing, or in the sense of they're reconstructing the world. They're not coming to terms, as Aristotle was, with a lot of common features of experience. Now, when we when we look at Aristotle's definition of happiness, it's kind of interesting as a starting off point. It talks about happiness as the exercise of virtue. So he emphasizes that it's an activity, okay, that conduces to happiness. And he also emphasizes this issue of virtue. Now, I've talked a lot, I think, about how virtue is a social value. When we think about virtues like compassion or courage or temperance, we think of things that are actually beneficial to the society, that when individuals in the society demonstrate such virtues, the society tends more to flourish. Individuals contribute more, individuals are more reliable. Much of our evolutionary development has been in the direction of socialization, right? We've, I think, often heard the definition of humanity as is constituted of rational, creatures, right? Creatures capable of thought. Well, what makes people capable of thought is language. And what makes language, which the ultimate source of language is the need to facilitate social coordination in order to promote human survival. That human beings, as Pascal pointed out a few 400 years ago, are frail creatures relative to a lot of predators, that would have presented a threat, to early humanity. Well, our greatest strength is in group enterprise, group activity. And that is entirely the result of what language permits. Language does not exist so that we can communicate ideas to each other. Without language, there would be no ideas to communicate. Language exists for purposes of coordinating activity. Okay? So a lot of human nature, and I'll put quotations around that, is understandable in terms of what helps facilitate our survival as social organisms. So, for example, I know I mentioned that there was a question about love. Here's an aspect of that. A human infant cannot survive on its own. It needs years of attentive care, right? Well, it's possible to imagine that human beings were so designed that they would instinctively provide that care without necessarily feeling an emotion to accompany it. But we can easily see how an emotion like love of parent to child, can sort of make that bond firmer and help facilitate that survival, help ensure that that parent will be committed, will remain committed. We can also see that since child rearing takes so many years, that there is value in a love emotion between adults, between parents, to help preserve that familial unit. It's effective from the standpoint of human survival. Okay? But, well, so in any case, so Aristotle sees happiness as an activity of virtue. And the virtues in general are social virtues. In that sense, we can see it as a type of, well, if we think of, another fascinating aspect of Aristotle's view of happiness is that he famously commented that one should not consider a human being happy until they died. That he saw happiness as sort of a lifetime enterprise of activity that was moving in the direction of good behavior, good values, behavior between extremes. He emphasized a mean of behavior between, like for example, courage was the mean, the middle sort of point between rashness and indolence or fear. So I've made comment. Well, I'm not sure I talked about this, but I wrote a film script once that I sort of made into this movie, Torture, investigating the nature of extreme suffering and the philosophical response to it. And as part of the introduction to that, I had quoted from a book on the history of torture. Now, it turns out there are not many accounts of people, first-person accounts of people that have survived extreme torture for obvious reasons. But there was one that came down from the early 19th century about a sailor who had been flogged. And flogging, with a whip was an extreme torture, especially if one was administered a large number of lashes. And this particular victim, I think, experienced 50. And he talked about the fact that in the course of this torture, all of his previous life dissolved into dream. And the only reality was not any of the pleasures that he had experienced, not any of the happiness he had known. The only reality that presented itself to him was extreme pain, only pain. The experience of torture undercut the entire previous reality of his life. Okay? So the final moments, can have that power. So that was, I think, one of the things the type of thing that Aristotle had in mind. But what's especially important about Aristotle's sort of definition is this notion of an activity. Okay. Now, I've mentioned before that one way that we can account for human unhappiness, human suffering, is the tendency for human beings to see the world or to imagine they can see the world from the outside. Okay? By that, I mean our sense, for example, of reality is of the world that exists independent of ourselves. Our sense of death relates to that type of perspective, seeing the world as if we were not in it or part of it. That's the only type of world that we could die to. Okay? Well, that's the essence of existentialism. The notion that we cannot leave the world to view it. Okay? We cannot disengage. But it's the common human relationship to experience that we can imagine, that our sense of reality is of the world seen from the outside. We imagine that we go to sleep at night, the world doesn't cease to exist. We imagine we are often self-conscious, like aware of ourselves, as if we are seeing ourselves from the outside. Our sense of our limitations is as if we had a nature that we could evaluate independent of our experience of the world. Well, that is, now, it's a fundamental mistake in our thinking. It's a fundamental illusion, and it's a mistake that derives ultimately from language itself. And from our social tendencies, the fact that language is really lifting us out of ourselves so that we see ourselves as one among a society of equals, let's say. Okay. Well, it's that tendency to disengage from the world in our perception of ourselves in relation to the world that can be said to be the ultimate source of unhappiness. And so the opposite, engagement, absorption in something or other, can be seen as the key to happiness itself. Now, I think we've probably heard, many of you have probably heard, this notion that happiness is not something that we pursue, it's something that overtakes us. It's something that overtakes us when we are otherwise engaged in some way, in some activity. That engagement is when we lose ourselves and can be said to be fundamentally happy. Once we become self-aware, the spell is broken. Now, one of the first books I read in philosophy was by Albert Camus. It was The Myth of Sisyphus, a book that I read. Actually, I was 13 when I read this book. I wandered into a bookstore in New York, and I picked it off the shelf, and I mostly read it in the bookstore, just standing there. It was striking. The opening line of that book, by the way, still rings in my mind. The fundamental philosophical question is suicide, whether or not life is worth living. That's how the book opens. Its title refers to an ancient Greek myth about a king, Sisyphus, who had engaged in various unacceptable behavior, to the gods, to Zeus, among others, and was punished by being condemned for all eternity to push a huge boulder up a hill every day. And at the end of the day, when the boulder reached the top, would fall back down. And the next day, Sisyphus would begin again. So it was an endless task. It was a futile task. And it's often been seen as a horrific circumstance. Camus investigated that in the course of this philosophical treatise that he wrote, which, by the way, Camus was like the first philosopher, the first really author of any note that I read complete. I read all of his works. But it's been a number of years, and what I found was that even though Camus is considered an existentialist, his sense of existentialism, as I now see existentialism, does not quite reach to the essence of it. In other words, the circumstance of, the circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view it. Camus is not quite clear on that. But what he is clear on is that while Sisyphus is engaged in that task, insofar as he is engaged in it, focused upon it, he could be considered happy. Now, obviously, when the stone rolls back, to the bottom of the hill, and Sisyphus is left to contemplate, perhaps, what he has to do the next day for all eternity, that's the moment when unhappiness can enter. But while he's actively engaged in the task, absorbed in the task, that's when we can be considered happy. It's true broadly. There's a famous comment about happiness by Garrett, the 19th century German writer that was actually Einstein's favorite author. Garrett wrote, "If you would be happy, you must do your duty." And what's your duty? The demand of the hour. Now, notice how that fits into this analysis. It's an activity, just as Aristotle considered it an activity, and it's a matter of engagement. You have a duty, you carry out the duty, whatever that is. Now, that can be a duty to yourself. It might mean, making your bed when you get up in the morning. It might mean going through some ritual. It might mean, exercising for a certain amount. It might mean whatever, your personal sort of regimen might be. It might be duty, obviously, with respect to social demands, right? Whatever, and when we think of duty, we're typically thinking of social calling, like what is morally right, what is expected of us. Well, but it's still an activity. One of the common things that human beings do is procrastinate, right? Put things off. The next time you're tempted to procrastinate, try to apply Garrett's advice. Do whatever it is you were going to put off and see how much better you feel right after doing it. Okay? And it applies to tasks small and large. So again, it illustrates this notion of happiness as engagement. Okay? And when we are disengaged, when we are self-conscious, when we are seeing ourselves from outside circumstance, outside the world, if you were, that's when unhappiness enters the picture. Okay? So, and in terms of what those engagements are, well, thinking about it heuristically, I've made some comments in the past about like that Hindu admonition, you become what you admire, right? Deeply, truly admire. So if you are moving in the direction of that admiration, whatever that might be, whatever that, kind of overall engages your life, right? Your energies, your efforts. That is the foundation of happiness, or at least the kind of happiness that Aristotle, was imagining, the kind of happiness that, on a daily basis can sustain it. Now, obviously, since unhappiness is pervasive, right, based on some of the comments I gave you at the beginning, it's hard to remain engaged, right? I mean, we have this tendency, and again, language is one of the generators of it, of seeing ourselves outside our circumstance. Okay, one of the major investigations of happiness was undertaken by a 18th century English man of letters, actually considered the greatest of all English men of letters, not greatest of all writers, that's Shakespeare in English, but poet, biographer, critic, author of the first English dictionary that he did entirely on his own, Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson wrote a book of moral philosophy, it's considered, called Rasselas. And that book is specifically an investigation of happiness and the degree to which human beings struggle to achieve it. And the book is set in this idyllic, this perfect valley called Happy Valley, where all human needs are supposedly met. The problem is the main thing that challenges sustained happiness in that environment, boredom. Not various kinds of evil, not suffering, boredom. Because when you are bored, you are disengaged. Now, the main type of engagement that we want to investigate is the type of engagement that philosophical rigor imagines. And that enters the picture when we talk about some of the more extreme demands that people place on human life and human satisfaction, happiness. For example, there's a 20th century playwright, Ionesco, French playwright, who very successful, of course, of his lifetime. After one of his plays, I think it was The Bald Soprano, one of his most famous plays, had an enormous success, an enormously successful opening in Paris or in New York. A critic came up to his wife and asked her rhetorically, "Monsieur Ionesco must be very happy at the success of his play, the great success." And Madame Ionesco replies very calmly, "No, Monsieur Ionesco is not happy, because Monsieur Ionesco knows that one day he must die." Well, okay, now if that's the bar, right, to achieving happiness, that's a very high bar, right? That's a religious bar, right? That's where, now we have the same thing expressed in Buddhism. The notion that Siddhartha Gautama was motivated by his encounter with disease, old age, and death. And once he had that awareness of the fate that was in store for human beings, he couldn't do anything but direct himself to end disease, old age, and death some way, somehow. Now, we've talked about how he was able to do that through ending the concepts of disease, old age, and death. But what was most important is that his feeling was that there was no time for socializing. There was no time for a casual dinner, a meal. There was no time for play. First, disease, old age, death had to be ended. You know, there are various metaphors of this within the Buddhist tradition, of the world being on fire or one's house being on fire. And the need is not to continue one's meal, but to leave and put out the fire. Okay, well, for Siddhartha, the fire was mortality, disease, old age, and death. And until that was extinguished, there was no room for anything else. So again, that's a very high demand, you know, for what is a condition for Siddhartha of happiness, right? Just as Ionesco is placing a very high demand on it. We have something similar in the life of Martin Luther, the creator of, really the originator of Christian Protestantism, okay, in the West. Martin Luther, who lived in the 16th century, was a Catholic to begin with. He believed in confession, the right of confession. And in that tradition, or at least in Martin Luther's relationship to the Catholic tradition, whenever he would have a thought, a problematic thought, an evil thought, a thought that was not worthy of a man of God, right? He had to go to the confessional and confess that thought. If he did not confess that thought in his thinking, because he had a very strict, extreme interpretation of the Roman Catholic faith and demand, If he had that thought and did not confess it immediately, and he happened to die at that moment for whatever cause, he believed he would go to hell. He would be damned eternally. So he would go to the confessional. He lived at a monastery. He would go to the confessional, confess his thoughts, leave the confessional, have an untoward thought, an unsavory thought, a thought that needed to be confessed, go back to the confessional. He was never able to leave the confessional effectively. That's why he had to create Protestant Christianity, the notion of salvation, redemption by faith alone. Until that religious insight was achieved on his part, there was no happiness for Martin Luther. He needed a much deeper solution. So, Aristotle's approach to happiness, that of engagement in activity, if it's activity that's virtuous, so much the better, because we're reinforced for that activity. We might get like a serial killer, might get tremendous pleasure out of his acts of violence and horror, right? But it's a problematic path because it's not societally embraced or endorsed, it's condemned, right? And so it's not a prescription for a happy life. Now, in the context of judgment, right, we want to be always aware of the fact that we don't know another person's temptations, and that people typically are aware of the consequences or the potential consequences of their actions. So for a given serial killer, for all we know, somebody that kills 4 or 5 people did everything they could to avoid killing 40 or 50. We don't know. We can't judge. And that's actually something that is discussed extensively within the Jewish tradition, the Jewish Talmud, that you don't know the strength of another's temptations. So, but given the choice, right, heuristically, we would like to go in the direction, right, of engagements of socially sanctioned types of behaviors. But those will not fully address that extremity of dissatisfaction with the basic conditions of existence. For Buddhism, for example, life is dukkha, awry, something fundamentally wrong that needs to be answered. So that, until it's answered, as Siddhartha answered it, there's no significant happiness. Okay? So again, that's a very high demand. Well, it's a demand, as I've discussed in the past, that philosophy can address. And it's the demand that philosophy addresses at the point of rigor, where you step into that rigorous representation. Now, what is that? Well, some of the vocabulary for it, like it's an epistemic point, right? Remember, I've distinguished epistemic space, a rigorous space, a space where every two things are rigorously distinct from each other. It's an epistemic point. It is an existential point. We exist in epistemic space. We exist in difference from everything else. It is an Einsteinian point, a point of still centrality, a point, remember one of the important aspects of Einstein's work, he's doing the physics of existentialism, that if you cannot see the world from the outside, which you can't, then you cannot ever know that you are in motion, right? The reason that we do not feel that we are moving, even though modern physics represents us, or Newtonian physics represents us as being on a spinning earth, revolving around the sun, our Earth is spinning at like 1,600 kilometers per hour. Our speed around the sun is something on the order of 100,000 kilometers per hour. These are extraordinary speeds. Why don't we feel that we're moving? Why do we feel that we're at rest? Well, we feel that we're at rest because from the Einsteinian perspective, from the philosophical perspective, from the perspective of not being able to leave the world and view it from the outside, we're not moving at all. Every point is still when you are at that point. In the same way, each point is the point of origin. That's an epistemic point as well, the point of origin. If you investigate in physics where the black hole, where the Big Bang occurred, where it originated, the answer is everywhere, at every point, including this point, and including the point where each of you is. Okay? It is the point of dignity, right? The point of dignity is the point where we are unique, not replaceable, fundamentally distinguishable and different from everything else. What we are experiencing, each of us right now, has never been experienced in the history of the world by anybody. And that is true of all of our experiences in detail. That's the fundamental dignity of existence, each individual existence. The fact that we can't leave the world, it means we can't remove ourselves from the world, right? That means ultimately that the entire universe mathematically can be said to map, to converge on each individual existential point. Each point of existence is a point of universal convergence. Now, that is something that I summarize. I wanted to show you. All of this stuff, by the way, that I'm talking about is summarizable in these relationships. The heuristic, A equals A, that's the basic condition of logic. Okay, that's operating within a heuristic space. Two things are approximately the same. The epistemic, A is not equal to A, there's no identity at all, no equivalence. And then this final one, the heuristic converges to the epistemic. That's that notion of universal convergence. All the points of existence can be said to map to each individual point in the world because each individual point in the world is not removable from the whole. And each individual existential point, a point of real existence, that's an epistemic point. That's what we exist ultimately as, that universal convergence. But when we are in that existential epistemic point, what are we experiencing? Okay. What does the world look like? Okay. How does that specifically relate to the experience of happiness at the extreme in which religions are imagining salvation, enlightenment? Well, that takes us to this notion that we commonly encounter, I think, in contemporary society, of mindfulness and being in the moment. Now, turns out the common sense, the normal notion of being in the moment is not quite the philosophical sense. The philosophical sense is more extreme, as you might imagine. Right? The basic idea is that you want to calm your mind from your concerns about the past, your worries or anticipations about the future. You want to kind of try to put yourself in the moment where the past and the future are not preying upon, your consciousness, your sense of well-being. Okay, you're not feeling regret about things that might have happened previously. You're not worried about what might be in store. Okay, So we can see why being in the moment has an attractive psychological aspect to it. Philosophically, the moment is part of what is rigorously knowable. The past is not rigorously knowable. It's not immediately present. And I've mentioned, I've given examples of how the nature of future experience can change our sense of the past. Like the most radical example is, if we wake up tomorrow and this world is not anything like it was now, but we wake up to a totally different reality that nevertheless persists, well, then the past, our sense of the past, is completely changed, completely transformed. So the past, what we're not directly experiencing, is not rigorously knowable. We can be wrong about it. Our memory can be wrong. Our histories can be wrong. Okay? The future hasn't happened yet. So clearly, no claim about the future can have a rigorous status, right? I've emphasized that a lot. So we have to, if we're dealing with an epistemic kind of experience of incontrovertible aspects of the world, past can't be part of it, we're not directly experiencing it. The future can't be part of it, we're not directly experiencing it, okay? So we see the philosophical motivation for moving into the moment. But what's decisive about the philosophical relationship to the experience is that our sense of objects, what we're seeing, is based upon past experience and is an anticipation of future behavior, future performance. We have to remove from our minds our sense of what that object that we're experiencing might have done in its past and might be likely to do in the future. We have to try to come to terms with our experience as if we were seeing the world for the very first time. There's a philosopher that I've mentioned, Stanley Cavell, who was the philosopher actually that I had for my Wittgenstein course when I was in college. Well, Stanley Cavell, especially towards the end of his life, talked a lot about the experience of earliness and the value of that experience. Well, earliness is Cavell's term, and I don't think he put it in the context that I'm putting it in right now, is Cavell's term for what the world is like when we first experience it, before we have a sense of any history of objects, before these sensory impressions that we're receiving are organized into objects. So basically, when you're looking around and seeing objects, you're projecting from the past. You are effectively seeing the past. To see the world in the moment rigorously, philosophically, is to see no objects. Not that there's nothing there, it's just that they're not in your mind organized into physical entities. Okay? They're uncharacterizable. Remember, one of the things about epistemic space is that concepts do not arise within it. Concepts group things together. Epistemic space does not group things together. It's a space not of convergence, but of divergence, where everything is distinct, separated, separatable. Okay? So if you're not clustering things based upon various kinds of similarities, you don't have concepts, and you don't ultimately have our sense of a physical object. So I guess one of the ways to imagine the world in its early encounter philosophically would be a close way to approximate would be to close your eyes, okay, where the objects sort of disappear. But close your eyes when there's at least light, ambient light in your environment that you're otherwise sort of sensing, okay? But if you are seeing objects, you are not in the moment, okay? You are still projecting from past into future, and you're organizing things based upon your past experience. But the most important thing about that epistemic experience is, first of all, it's an experience from within the world, right? That we are not, when we're doing philosophy, abstracting ourselves to some imaginary platform or plane or perspective outside the world, which again is not rigorously justifiable or characterizable, right? Because we can't, in principle, do that. So we are engaged, but we're engaged not with an activity, except maybe insofar as the activity of coming to terms with what we're actually experiencing in that moment. We are nevertheless engaged in the world with whatever the present experience uncharacterized is. That's what I'm describing is equivalent to mystical union with God. What I'm describing is equivalent to Buddhist nirvana, where the concepts vanish, okay? And the concepts, you know, will vanish when the objects no longer are recognizable, okay? That's that experience. But notice it is an experience of extreme engagement, where you are by definition within, not outside, not self-conscious, not imagining the experience of other minds, other individuals, not imagining anything except the concrete nature of what you are experiencing without interpretation, okay? Without relying upon the past as a guide to the future. And that becomes the philosophical experience that is not just the experience of freedom, the freedoms that philosophical truth, ultimate truth can provide, can give us, but also is that extreme engagement, that extreme connection with the world that is the essence of happiness. So that's how philosophy can achieve what the religions have aspired to, but can also achieve what Aristotle had in mind with an engaging activity, or what Camus had in mind with an engagement, but the engagement is an existential engagement with the reality that cannot be challenged, the incontestable reality. Now, one thing I wanted to do to close before we do the questions is, as you know, I write aphorisms. I use a lot of aphorisms, in doing these talks. But I also write books that are effectively poems, concentrated philosophy, but where there's a music. And I wanted to read one of those. It's very short. They're highly concentrated, so they can be short. This actually happens to be about 16 separate aphorisms, but it'll take 30 seconds or so to read. And I'm reading it not so that you necessarily understand the thoughts. They're a little bit hard to understand without actually seeing them and maybe going through them, and maybe even at this point my explaining or providing some commentary. But I wanted you to just hear the sound, because the sound communicates some of what philosophy is aiming for in terms of this solution to our circumstances. So let me just pull this up and I will read it. Okay, the title of the book, And again, it's poetry, so there's a lot of rhyme and rhythm. The title is The Magic Chalice, a Palace for Alice. And the Alice is Alice in Wonderland. That's what I'm imagining. Meaning conditions that a view imprisons, wrongly, in specificity. The concept of God intuits rigor, heuristic to a path, epistemic to a floor, inclined to an open door. Generality matters, that worlds are things, to relationality, casting life wings. The tragic sense rudely complains that epistemics slight heuristic domains, as if dignities instrumentality and fantasies agree, as if such worlds could ever be, with everything before our eyes, plain as day to see, in wonderland's swirling snows and sands, alighting Alice free. Okay, it's the magic chalice, a palace for Alice. So it gives you a little sense of the music, within the philosophy. Okay, so I think with that, I will conclude this talk on happiness, and though the issues that came up will continue to come up, in other talks, and I'll be clarifying them from a variety of directions. We see how the core, of my work is compressible to a few basic relationships, really, that effectively, as I showed you, are as much mathematical as verbal. So we can always go back to those formulations, and it provides a point of centrality to all of this. Everything can be related to that. But okay, so what I want to do now is to go through the questions that were left over from last time. The first question is about Plato's cave. The question is, what is the significance, what's going on with Plato's cave allegory? Okay, it's actually a famous section of Plato's Republic, one of probably actually Plato's most famous of all philosophical dialogues. It's a large work about the just organization of society. Okay? But it's also an investigation of the nature of reality, as philosophy is, almost always. The cave allegory consists of a circumstance in which human beings are imagined to be chained inside a cave. They're chained sort of in the middle of the floor of the cave. They're facing a wall. On the wall, they see shadows of objects, shadows of people, shadows of maybe animals, of chariots, whatever were the common objects of the day, okay, for Plato. And Plato was writing this around 300 BC, 380 BC or something like that. Anyway, so these individuals, human beings, are watching these images, these shadow images playing on the wall. Okay? They're chained there, not that they are imprisoned per se, though there's an element of that idea of imprisonment. But basically, so they can't turn around, okay? If they could turn around, and they imagine these images, these shadows, to be the reality. That's existence. Those are objects, those are real forms, that's what the world is made of, these shadow images, okay? What they don't see, what they can't turn around and see, is that behind them is a source of light. And that light is casting, is is shining on these actual objects that are all behind them that they can't see, real three-dimensional objects. All they can see are the shadows, and they think the shadows are the reality, okay? Well, that is a metaphor for Plato of our world, our existence. In other words, got the idea being that we're not seeing the reality. The world around us that we are observing is not truly real in the way that the objects are and the shadows are less so, okay? The idea being that, well, ultimately, this takes the form that the objects of our experience, let's say tables and chairs, are not the ultimate and perfect reality. For Plato, the ultimate and perfect reality were what he called forms or ideas. The idea of a chair, the image you have of a chair, almost like the definition of a chair. This notion of Plato actually relates to his relatively primitive, understanding of the nature of a word, the nature of the meaning of a word. For Plato, a word like chair or rectangle, was what the essence of that concept amounted to. We've seen through the work of Wittgenstein that the meaning of a word is better understood as its use, and that there isn't like a thread that needs to run through everything that is a chair, for us to use that term. There are family resemblances, relationships, similarities among all the things we call chair. But for Plato, there was an essence to chair, and that was the ultimate reality. And the actual real physical chairs that we encounter are corruptions. They are less perfect, less pure. And for Plato, the enterprise of philosophy was to come to understand this realm of ideas, of perfect forms, of unchanging forms. Now, what's really significant about Plato's allegory and the view of the world behind it is, again, the idea that we're not encountering, reality. We're encountering something less than, less perfect than, but in any case, not ultimate reality. You have that expressed in an earlier philosopher, Heraclitus, that the reality is hidden from us. You see that in the work of Immanuel Kant, the notion that ultimate reality is what he called noumena. And the phenomena, the things that we experience, are how our mind is processing that ultimate reality, like a virtual reality device. Okay, so all we can encounter is basically what our mind is processing for us, what the reality would be independent of our mind. If we could, again, see the world from the outside, that's inaccessible to us. That's unknowable. So there's that. Now, for Plato, that ultimate reality was knowable, as we know ideas of chair, table, rectangle, circle, triangle, those kinds of forms. The enterprise of philosophy was to come to understand, those forms, those essences to things. But there's something, when I'm talking about like epistemic space as being the rigorous reality, that's right in front of our eyes. That's not hidden. It's just we are organizing it, again, a little bit like Kant might describe, through the virtual reality device of our brain, the organization of experience into objects, like repeating forms. The table we saw yesterday is the same as the table we're seeing now, the table we'll see in 5 minutes. And we link those together. Our brain, makes those kinds of connections and those categorizations. But the epistemic reality is right in front of our eyes. Eden is right in front of our eyes. It's just we have to come to learn to see it by removing those, like I was saying a minute ago, the sense of the past, and our knowledge of objects from that past experience and the projection of that into the future, we imagine them to be doing. So there's been throughout the history of philosophy a distinction made between true reality and something of our experience that's not quite at that level. For me, that distinction is made at the level of the heuristic versus the epistemic. But it's not hidden. It's in front of our eyes. It's just, it has to be seen. And it has to be seen through that sense of earliness, of encounter, how we would see the world if we were encountering it for the first time. Okay, so that was a question about Plato's cave allegory. The second question was about altruism. Now, altruism is like what role does altruism play, or what's the significance of it? Altruism is effort on behalf of others. If you are altruistic, you are maybe making personal sacrifices, for the benefit of others, to help others. The most extreme examples would be, doing something where you sacrificed your life for the benefit of someone else or some cause. Okay, philosophy sees altruism as being grounded in it's a heuristic concept. It's grounded in our evolutionary past. It's grounded in the notion that we benefit from what society can accomplish. We benefit through group enterprise. We benefit through cooperative enterprise. To facilitate that type of enterprise, we have emotions that support that. We have emotions of empathy. We imagine that we can intuit or have a sense of what's going on inside someone else's mind. We can imagine, we feel what their suffering may be like, and we have emotional responses to that. Those kinds of responses, those compassionate responses, are in the same category as altruism, and that is something that helps society, thrive, helps society flourish. So altruism isn't something so much that has a pure philosophical value, right? It's something that has value in relation to society, and its origins are in our evolutionary past in terms of what kinds of emotions help advance social enterprise. Okay? Something similar is operating in the third question. I was asked about the philosophical understanding of true love. Well, first of all, I've mentioned that love too can be understood in its evolutionary context, its socially facilitating role, that we can imagine being involved in group activities where we didn't have emotions, we were just kind of programmatically inclined in certain directions. But having emotions of compassion or having emotions of love for other people helps bind us together, helps facilitate social cooperation and enterprise. Right? It has survival value for the human species, and survival value for societies that are the main way that the human species has flourished. Okay? But there's another more purely philosophical aspect. One, there's something from actually that play that we had made available on World Philosophy Day some months ago, Phalaris' Bull, where I talk about the romantic. And the romantic can be seen as an expression or as an embodiment or an aspect, certainly as a central aspect of true love, where the romantic is the unbounded. Young summers and sunsets and oceans and evenings and longings and fulfillments extending forever. Philosophy establishes the unbounded, incontestably. Truth more than beauty, pure and true romance. Now I'm quoting from Valeris's Bull, that play where I was discussing the experience of love and true love. Well, this notion of unboundedness, right, is central to, I think, the understanding of it in the following senses. That, like, when people take marriage vows, for example, there's often language about a commitment forever, or till death do us part, but effectively forever. And even actually, forever is a common term that true love seems to embrace. There's a series of advertisements in the United States, anyway, about diamonds, where a diamond is forever, love is forever. That sense of unboundedness. There's the sense that other human relationships have more limits, right? Like friends have certain boundaries that they honor with each other. There's the parent-child relationship has very specific types of boundaries, right? Well, romantic love is imagined to be the least bounded of those. So there's more permitted, on the part of two individuals engaged in that type of loving romantic relationship. There's more they exchange. There's more they share. There's less bounds that they embrace. And that sense of the unbounded and the romantic and true love actually also relates to that 19th century literary movement of Romanticism, where there's that rebellion against a sense of limitation, the sublime that romantic poets, painters, sought is really a sense of something that is, again, limitless, unbounded horizon, that just doesn't end. So that's the most important philosophic aspect of true love, the sense of being unbounded. The other aspect of that question was, do I get solace from my art? And I will say, fundamentally, I get solace from philosophy. That is the strongest influence on my life. I mean, I live it, I use it, I take it seriously. It's not just an academic exercise. But the art is an enterprise where I am engaged, right? When I am doing an artwork, I am committed to that process. And when I'm doing an artwork, I'm not doing it as a philosopher or as a scientist who's now doing art. And I'm not doing it to illustrate in the art anything from science or philosophy or poetry. I'm doing art as an artist would. If I'm dealing with colors, I'm focused on the nature of the colors and their interrelationships and line and gradients. I'm interested only in pictorial elements. But one of the important aspects of art that's often not appreciated is something that I think it was T.S. Eliot, the poet, remarked: art is more self-discipline than self-expression. And that discipline represents a kind of engagement right? Involvement in an activity that is central, right? The essence of the experience of happiness. And just to show you something. Okay, so we now, one of the things I paint are these poles, right? And these poles are made up of a series of discrete images, which are brushstrokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, in this case, 5 different brushstrokes. When I do a work like this, and I'll do it in sequence, from the top of the pole to the bottom, the first image I paint will often be influenced by something in my mind, something I saw that day, something that's occupying me, okay? That will determine the first image. Once the first image is down, every subsequent image is determined by the images that I've painted. So the second image is now relating only to the first, not to anything else going on in my mind. The third image is only relating to the first two. In other words, I'm now working within the discipline of what the work of art needs to exist as an independent object and to exist independently of me. Okay, so that it eventually acquires its own personality. Okay, so that type of discipline is, again, central to the experience of happiness. And that, so yes, I am happy doing art, but nothing for me has the power of philosophy. And in fact, when my mother was under, I'll talk about this some other time in more detail, but when my mother was going through a serious illness, I was painting, and I found that the painting was not helping me emotionally. I had to go to philosophy for definitive, levels of consolation. Okay, so for me, philosophy is stronger than art. Okay, but I do infuse the philosophy with artistic elements, right? So the writing has a poetic aspect, and that's an artistic aspect. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for showing your artwork. From today's talks, we also got some comments and some questions. So first, let me read you the comments. So we have got 3 thumbs up and 5 likes. So it means people are sending you big thanks. From Facebook and from YouTube, we have a very active participant who has been listening to your philosophical talks for, let me see. Okay, so he says that he has been listening to your talks for about 5 months in here. And Mr. Friedman, I've been listening to your talks for about 5 months. I literally uncovered kind of Plato's allegory for myself. I'm utterly grateful for your contribution to our awareness of philosophy. That kind of comment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And that, yeah, also we have got some very nice comments like, thank you very much for your talks. It has been nice. Thank you. And we have got 4 questions that we can answer in the next talks. So let me quickly read them out. So the first question was, would it be possible to Mr. Friedman to read the previous questions, which follows up with this one. I've seen rich people, but they weren't happy. However, all happy people I've seen were not rich. Why do people prioritize richness rather than happiness? Which is a very good question. And then the next one was, we have been living on this planet for 4.5 billion years. There were wars, catastrophic, massive amount of deaths, viruses. Why cannot we define main goal, our purpose, which people have to be reunited for? Okay, and then the next one. What's the difference between life in terms of biology and life in terms of philosophy in your eyes? Are there any controversies? And the last one, the first one from this person. Hi, I speak a little. I've been learning. Could you give us some tips for learning English? Thank you, Mr. Friedman.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the questions, and we will address those, again, after. I'll summarize basically what they are of at the beginning, but then I will address them, answer them after next week's after I finish next week's talk. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's conclude our philosophical talks. Thank you very much one more to everyone who has joined us. We have also got one guest from Bangladesh. He says, "Hello, I'm from Bangladesh." Hello, welcome to our philosophical talks.
Welcome. Very nice.
One more time. Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman, for such amazing talks that you give us weekly. And also, we would like to give big thanks to the U.S. General Consulate, to American Space Almighty for organizing this event, and also for you all for joining us, giving our comments and feedbacks. And we will be glad to see you next week as well, and delighted to answer all of your questions. So thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
And
And please join us next week. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a great week and see you all.
Yes.